Hello everyone and welcome to this training session on NFR C1 Patients, Private Property and Finances. Today we're going to go through some of the key details that you will need to know from NFR C1 Patients, Private Property and Finances. In terms of an agenda, I will be covering off the main sections of NFR C1 from a high-level perspective and giving you an overview of the key concepts to be aware of as part of today's training session. Just to flag from the start, we can't cover everything in full detail, and there is an onus on staff to read the documents themselves just to ensure that they're fully briefed on their day-to-day requirements. Firstly, what are the National Financial Regulations? So they're a set of policy documents which set out the financial controls for the organisation. They're not meant to be detailed procedural documents for financial processes or activities, as these are contained within your local procedures. But the aim of the NFRs is to provide high-level controls to guide your local procedures. Secondly, why is this particular training important? It's important that you're aware of the controls and guidance that you must follow when you're involved with patients' private property and their finances. Moving on to an important question which discusses who is the actual target audience for the NFRs. In short, the NFRs have a very broad reach. They apply to all permanent, temporary and agency staff of all HSE divisions, CHOs, hospital groups where services are provided on behalf of the HSE, and Section 38 and 39 providers, where services are being provided on behalf of the HSE or where HSE grant aid and funding is being received. Moving on then to the purpose of NFR C1. So NFR C1 sets out guidance in relation to how the HSE provides a service to care for a client's private property, referred to as Patients' Private Property, PPP. It sets out key controls and processes that must be in place so that PPP is handled and processed in a compliant manner. Overall, the key objectives are to provide for the safe care of PPP, limit the HSE's liability in the event of any loss or damage to PPP, promote clients' independence, properly record and account for any movements in the funds held, comply with key legislation such as the Mental Health Act 2001 and the Assisted Decision Making Act 2015. So a list of the key legislation can be found in Section 2 of the NFR. And the last key objective is to comply with relevant criteria issued by HICWA and other related standards. So PPP is not limited to a client's funds. When we are referring to PPP, examples may be things like money and funds placed in a PPP account, documents that provide access to monies or facilitate the future transfer of monies, clothing and footwear, jewellery and other small valuable items, luggage, pension books, personal items of furniture, ornaments and anything of sentimental value. So the next few slides will focus on the concept of capacity, which is central to how PPP is managed. As per the Assisted Decision Making Act of 2015, the following is stated. A person's capacity shall be assessed on the basis of his or her ability to understand, at the time that a decision is to be made, the nature and consequences of the decision to be made by him or her in the context of the available choices at that time. It's important to note when initially considering questions of capacity, it is a functional test of capacity that is relevant and not a mental health examination or assessment. There is a presumption of capacity as a starting point. Next, we'll look at the functional test in a little bit more detail. So a functional test is the way in which HSE staff can make an assessment of a client's capacity to make decisions for themselves. An important principle is that it focuses on how the decision is made rather than the actual outcome or consequence of the decision. The functional test indicates that the client is unable to decide if they cannot understand the information relevant to the decision, retain that information long enough to make a voluntary choice, use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision, communicate their decision whether by talking, writing, using sign language, assistive technology or any other means, or if the implementation of the decision requires the act of a third party to communicate by any means with that third party. Next, I'm going to take a look at the impact or outcome of a functional test. The outcome of the functional test will impact the extent of intervention that may be required on behalf of clients by HSE custodians, and how the HSE is required to fulfil its role as custodians of PPP. As shown in the diagram, where a client is deemed to have functional capacity, decisions are entirely made by the client and HSE staff fulfil their specific wishes. However, where a client is deemed to have non-functional capacity, decisions do not automatically fall with the family. it may be appropriate for another person, including the HSE, to fall into a decision-making role on behalf of the client. This will depend on whether there is a legally appointed representative, LR, of the client. No person, including close family members, friends, carers or organisations, can make decisions on behalf of a client who lacks capacity, unless they have specified legal authority to do so. Some clients have fluctuating or changing capacity, and every effort should be made to find out their preferences in times where they have capacity to make that specific decision. The concept of a legally appointed representative is a central theme in the NFR and an important one to be aware of. Firstly, what is a legally appointed representative? So it's where a third party is appointed by a court to make decisions on behalf of another individual. There are three situations where client decision making may fall to third parties. Clients who are wards of court. So ward of court is the term used for a person who the courts deem to be unable to look after their affairs and has somebody appointed to do so on their behalf. Clients who have granted or enduring in power of attorney EPA to a person. And people who are next friend appointed by a court. In each scenario, a different party is responsible for decision making. Where there is a ward of court appointed, decisions are made by the committee in wardship on the client's behalf. Where the client has granted an EPA, decisions can be made by the appointee under an EPA on the client's behalf if the EPA is activated. And in cases where a next friend is appointed by a court, decisions can be made by a next friend on the client's behalf in accordance with the court appointment to that role. So there are a number of situations when clients' decision making fall to third parties. The NFR also deals with situations where there is no legally appointed representative, LR. So if a client lacks capacity and they do not have a LR, but decisions need to be made by the HSE, then the HSE must do the following. So they should take up the role of a decision maker on the client's behalf in relation to the client's property. Where a client does not have capacity and their will and preference in the matter is unknown, the HSE will act in the best interests of the client. They will focus solely on ensuring that the client's funds held by the HSE are safeguarded for the client's direct benefit. And they will only make decisions around client's funds if the client is unable to possess the capacity themselves at that time. In making client decisions, the HSE must examine all of the client circumstances. So firstly, they must follow the expressed will and preference of the client. Secondly, the known will and preference of the client. And thirdly, the best interests of the client. So clients may ask the HSE to manage their personal funds in designated PPP accounts, or where they are unable to give instructions around their finances. The HSE will intervene to support clients with a PPP service. This support may, for example, involve cashing a client's old age pension or disability allowance, or making the balance available for the client for personal spending. There are two main accounts for holding client funds. These are the local HSE unit and the PPP account. The local HSE unit deals with smaller sums from the day-to-day needs of the client, where the PPP account would manage the remainder, and this is centrally managed in Tullamore. There are important processes associated with the administration of PPP accounts, which must be followed. For example, when receiving lodging, holding funds and requesting funds. These are outlined in section 7.2 of NFR C1, and all staff should be aware of the relevant steps and controls associated with each process. So with receipting, first of all, a receipt is given to the person providing funds for a client, and a duplicate of the receipt should be retained in the receipt book for the HSE records. A separate PPP receipt book must be kept at each location for the sole purpose of issuing receipts in connection with PPP funds. Receipts issued must always be signed by the HSE staff member. All details of PPP receipts should be entered into the location cash book on the day of the receipt. Moving on to lodging then. So line managers must ensure that all PPP fund lodgements are made as frequently as necessary to the relevant PPP account. All PPP fund lodgements should be entered onto the PPP system, ledger and cash book. Line managers are required to comply with the handling of cash in accordance with NFR B5, banking, cash and card payments. Income collected must be counted and agreed by 2 staff members. Lodgements must be made each week or fortnight for residents PPP. And finally then, non-euro currencies must be converted to euro at the local exchange rate on the day of receipt, and recorded on the PPP system, the PPP ledger and the cash book in euro. Controls around holding funds is also important. Given that PPP funds are not HSE funds, it would be necessary to separate clients' funds from HSE funds to ensure the protection of both the client and the HSE. Clarity is also required as to what the client is expected to fund from his or her own resources and what clients can reasonably expect the HSE to fund as part of its core obligations. Security of non-cash PPP is also important. For personal effects, the main requirement is for HSE staff to limit any loss or damage to these effects insofar as possible. For jewellery and other small valuable items, clients should be advised such items cannot be safeguarded by the HSE unless they are handed in for safekeeping to an appropriate staff. HSE staff need to keep proper records of the receipt of such valuables and store all valuables in a secure area. Property may also include documents such as pension books that provide access to money or facilitate the future transfer of money to the HSE to be held in safekeeping for the client. Moving on then to the PPP reporting process. So there are various reports which must be produced relating to PPP accounts. It is the responsibility of the location administrator or manager to ensure that all PPP reports are produced accurately in a timely manner and they are reviewed before they are processed. The relevant reports are listed in the NFR and consist of the end of week reports where feasible but at a minimum monthly, end of month reports, so it might include the client's PPP control account, the client index or transaction summarised report or a list of credit balances. The monthly PPP bank reconciliation, so attention should be given in this reconciliation to outstanding checks more than 6 months. These are checks that have been written on behalf of the client but which have never been cashed. When these checks are identified in the bank reconciliation, they should be credited back to the client to whom they relate. The same can be said for the end of month financial control statements. Moving on then to the annual financial statements. So the PPP ledger should be completed and balanced on December 31st each year. And lastly then, the cash control accounts. So as I said, it is the responsibility of the location administrator or manager to ensure that all PPP reports are produced accurately and in a timely manner. There are specific procedures to follow in relation to PPP where a client has passed away, so this slide will touch on this. A deceased client's property is referred to as the deceased estate. So if a client dies and has funds remaining in the PPP account, balances may be released to a legal personal representative, an LPR, or a solicitor acting on behalf of the LPR. This is done to ensure that the assets can be distributed correctly. A legal personal representative can be appointed by the courts based on whether the client dies with a will or without a will, and this will determine the appropriate steps. Where the client has died with a valid will, referred to as dying testate, they will nominate one or more persons to act as executors of the estate. Where the client has died without a valid will, referred to as dying intestate, the next of kin seeks a grant of administration from the court to act as executors of the estate. The NFR provides handoff to PPP guidelines, which provides more specific steps to follow in these instances. On occasions, information requests do come in regarding PPP accounts, and the NFR also deals with these situations. These would typically come in from spouses, children, parents, siblings, relatives and friends, and as with any other element of managing PPP accounts, the appropriate response depends on the capacity of the client. For example, where the client has capacity, information can be provided to the client themselves, or a person who is nominated and recorded by the client as able to receive this information. Clients should be periodically provided with ongoing information on their PPP balances and transactions. Where the client can indicate their will and preference in managing their own affairs, the person seeking the information or making the request must have the legal authority to do so. Where a client's capacity is in question, a key client contact nomination form can be completed where no such person is already nominated. Naturally, where there is a key client contact, the information may be released, but only to the extent that it allows the key contact to assist the HSE. So that brings me to the end of the training session on NFR C1, Patients, Private Property and Finances. On this slide are the contact details for the governance and compliance team if anyone has any questions. So you can contact us on govn.compliance@hse.ie. On this slide as well, we have some useful training resources and also our Governance and Compliance YouTube channel, and that contains videos of each of the 11 individual NFRs, so they are good to watch. Most of them are just 15 or 20 minutes long, so they're good to watch if you just want a refresher on any of the NFRs. Your attendance and attention today is very much appreciated, and thank you for taking the time to watch this training session.